Good evening, everyone. I'd love to welcome you to Gauteng Alliance, the DNA webinar, where we are seeking to share a bit more about who we are. Just for the sake of for um, Hi, everyone. My name is Musa Ndinga, one of the catalysts for the Gauteng Alliance. I'd like to welcome you to our DNA series. Our DNA series where we seek to let people know a little bit more about who we are as the Gauteng Alliance. The Gauteng Alliance, as some of you may know, is a collaborative that exists to help churches and Christian organizations to work together for the sake of the gospel. Our vision is that we collaborate generously for kingdom growth and gospel impact in all of Gauteng. And our desire is to see over 200,000 people come to faith in Gauteng by the year 2030. So we welcome you to today's webinar. Over the past couple of months, we've been going through our DNA series that's really helping us to dig a little deeper in terms of who we are and some of our core convictions, so that you can think a bit more about who we are and what we do. And so for the first webinar that we looked at the idea of how the gospel really compels us to work together, to collaborate together, because we do more. We are convinced that we can do a much more together than we can do separately. So the gospel helps us in that. And then the second one, we looked at how the gospel compels us to be people who are involved in the issues of our neighbor and our community. And so those are the justice and mercy issues. And today we are looking at the topic of how the gospel really compels us to work not only among people who look like us or people we get along with, but also wider than that, in particularly working with the poor among us. And so to help us with that task, we have two guest speakers. Well, the first one I would like to introduce to you is Dr. Brian Lorris. He is the president and founder of the Kainos movement. He is a teaching pastor at the Summit Church in the US, and he's the author of several books. I think most of us will be familiar with some of his books. I think his most popular book is Insider, Outsider, which helps us to look into his own experience of being a Black minister in the evangelical world in the US. So hi, Brian, what a privilege that you could join us today. And then our next speaker is going to be Doug Van Meter. Doug has been married for 37 years to Jill. He has 5 daughters and 6 grandchildren. He is the pastor of Brackenhurst Baptist Church in Alberton for over 28 years. And he has lived in South Africa for over 31 years. And although originally it's from the US. Hi, Doug. Nice to meet you as well, brother. Just so you know, that after the way in which the format is going to work is that after every speaker has addressed us, we're going to give a brief time for Q&A, and the way in which Q&A is going to do. So if you have any questions, please type them into the group chat here on Zoom, and then we'll pick up some of the questions and ask them to the guests if you have any specific questions that you would like to ask our guests. So without wasting any more time, why don't we start with you, Brian? Brian, we know that the gospel or the Bible talks a lot about how we need to be reaching out to people all over the world, different people of different ethnicities. Yet our lived experience is that often this is difficult. Often we only reach out to those who look like us, and we fellowship with those who look like us. So perhaps share with us, brother, of how the gospel compels us not only to work and reach to those who look like us, but to everyone.
Well, thank you very much. Let me just say what a delight, a sincere delight it is to be able to take part in this gathering. You know, I was telling some colleagues of mine earlier today that I feel like we here in America have far more to learn from our South African, especially brothers and sisters and others across the continent than we do to offer. You know, we settled merely for legislative change and didn't really go as hard as we should have after relationships. And I think we are very much paying the price for that here in the States. So I come not as just one who is going to share, but one who is also eager to learn as well. So I'm grateful for the opportunity. So, you know, in my context in the United States, you know, as we are all enduring the pandemic, whatever was lurking beneath the surface prior to the pandemic, I think the pandemic has just exposed. And a lot of what the pandemic has exposed is relational tensions and strife that maybe we could ignore. But especially we're feeling here in America across racial and ethnic lines. And so that has just led to deep division, not just outside the church, but inside the church as well. Issues, you know, phrases like social justice, critical race theory have just been huge. And what I've discovered in my work as a pastor, especially trying to pastor people in the gospel of Jesus Christ and how that plays itself out racially and especially cross-ethnically, is that I have to, first of all, thread everything, especially when we talk about issues of race and ethnicity, back into the gospel of Jesus Christ and the cross and the empty tomb of our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. If I don't do that, I make this kind of an option. But if I show people that no, this is an expression, a indicator that I am a legitimate follower of Jesus Christ, then it's not really an option. And I avoid worldly categories and I show people what the scriptures have to say. And so what I like to begin with is that yes, we are saved by grace through faith, not of works. That's Ephesians chapter 2. That there is no amount of striving or good moral performance that can earn me God's favor. If I could do that, I wouldn't need a savior. The reason why we need a savior is we can't save ourselves. But praise God, we have someone who died in our place and for our sins. However, anybody can say they're saved. How do I legitimately know that I'm saved? And what the Bible postures for us along these lines is that one of the primary ways I know that I'm saved is that it's worked out in how I relate to other people. So for example, if you're reading Matthew chapter 18, Jesus says in so many words in Matthew 18 that an unforgiving Christian is an oxymoron. It is a contradiction in terms. So how can we claim to receive the vertical forgiveness of God through Christ for everything we've ever done, are doing, and will ever do, and yet hold a grudge against our brothers and sisters who've been made in the image of God? So Matthew 18 is clear. An unforgiving Christian is an oxymoron. Luke 12, Matthew 25 say in so many words that a greedy Christian is an oxymoron. You and I have been saved by the generosity of God. Paul said to the Corinthians of Jesus that though he was rich, yet for our sake he became poor, so that we by his poverty might become rich. Jesus Christ gave his all. And so having received the generosity of Christ and yet hoard the blessings of Christ and not share those with others, it is an affront to the gospel. First Peter tells me, as a husband, that he says, husbands, live with your wives in an understanding way, giving honor to her as the weaker vessel. Watch this, so that your prayers may not be hindered. In other words, if I am mistreating my spouse and not repenting of that, that impacts my relationship with God. Doesn't make me unsaved, but how I treat my wife should be an expression of the gospel of Jesus Christ pulsating through my life. And then in Galatians chapter 2, Paul would say a racist Christian is an oxymoron. He says, I had to confront Peter. Prior to the Jews showing up, Peter was hanging out with the Gentiles, but all of a sudden the Jews show up and he withdraws from them. And Paul said, I had to tell him that his conduct was out of step with the gospel. So what am I making a case here for? That this idea of reaching across ethnic lines, it's not just something nice to do. It is what it means to live out the gospel of Jesus Christ. Revelation chapter 5, John says, I looked up into heaven and I saw people from every nation, tribe, and tongue. They were purchased by the blood of Christ. We used to sing a song in our little American church here, red and yellow, black and white. They are precious in his sight. Jesus died for the sins of the world. And my future eternal reality is going to be doing life with people who don't look like, act like, think like, or vote like me. Well, now Jesus taught us to pray, our Father who is in heaven, hallowed be your name, your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. So if heaven is a profoundly Christocentric, diverse experience where the Lamb is in the middle of it all, then the church exists to give earth a preview of heaven. So what I'm trying to do here is I want to thread all of these things back into the gospel. The seminal text for this in the Bible, I believe, is Ephesians chapter 2. Ephesians chapter 2 can really be broken down into two sections. Verses 1 through 10 deal with our vertical relationship with God in Christ. He begins by saying in verses 1 through 3, listen, prior to getting saved, you were dead in your trespasses and sins. And then he goes, but God being rich in mercy. I love it. God doesn't just have mercy. He is rich in mercy. God has more mercy than we have mess. His mercy account will never show up insufficient funds. So we are saved by a rich, merciful God. And then he says several times, for it is by grace you have been saved through faith. There's one pastor friend of mine here in the States. He says, grace means you didn't eat your dinner, but you still get dessert. Grace means you didn't eat your dinner, but you still get dessert. It means to give someone something they do not deserve. That's grace. When I was in seminary, I was poor, extremely poor, and I had no way of paying for seminary. Now, the seminary I went to many years ago, they did not admit blacks. And then all of a sudden, they changed the rule, and then they began to wrestle with kind of the sin of their past. And so they offered a scholarship now for people of color when I was going to the school, that if you didn't have the resources and you were a person of color, you could go for free. Now, I hate admitting that to you. I absolutely hate admitting that to you. I would love to tell you that I got a scholarship because of my academic performance, right? That I got a merit-based scholarship. It's embarrassing to say that I got a scholarship for something I had no control over. And if you are disturbed by this story, then I want you to understand that what Paul is saying is that in the kingdom of heaven, no one gets a merit-based scholarship. We are saved by grace through faith. What gets us into the kingdom is what keeps us in the kingdom. And then he goes, beginning in verse 11 of Ephesians 2, he says, therefore. Now, you don't need to spend a day in seminary to figure this out. The therefore means that what he is about to say is connected to what he just said. He says, therefore, remember that at one time, you Gentiles, here it is, in the flesh. Now, this is interesting. Again, you don't need to spend a day in seminary to figure out that now Paul is going to go from the vertical dimensions of the gospel to now how that plays out horizontally, but not just horizontally, how it transgresses ethnic lines. See, what Paul is doing here is he's writing to a multi-ethnic church. If you follow Paul's footsteps in church planting in the book of Acts, you understand that whenever Paul walks into a city, he has two questions. These two questions are based on Romans 1:16. In Romans 1:16, Paul says, for I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God unto salvation to those that believe, to the Jew first, and also to the Greek or the Gentile. So when Paul walks into a place like Athens, he says, where do the Jews hang out? They point him to the synagogue. In Ephesus, same thing. Acts 19, where do the Jews hang out? They point him to the synagogue. He preaches Christ to the Jews. Now some Jews get saved, but he's not done. See, Paul isn't interested in just reaching part of the community. He wants to reach all of the community with the gospel. His next question is, where do the Gentiles hang out? In Athens, they point him up to Mars Hill. In Ephesus, they point him to the Hall of Tyrannus. He now preaches Christ to the Gentiles, and some Gentiles get saved. Now he has a problem. The problem is he's got two groups of people who are now saved, but they hate each other. Historically, they've never done life together. So what does Paul do? Well, had he followed the church growth movement in America in the mid-20th century, he would have started two separate churches. One for the Gentiles on the north side of town, one for the Jews on the south side of town, but Paul does not. Paul says, I'm going to start one church, and I'm going to call you to work out horizontally what you have just experienced vertically, which is reconciliation. That is why I believe the multi-ethnic church is one of the most powerful and profound statements to the veracity and truthfulness of the gospel. The multi-ethnic church is a profound apologetic to the far-reaching dimensions of the cross and empty tomb. It is when you have people who get together who historically have been divided but are loving one another under the cross of Jesus Christ. That is a powerful statement. Now, why, Paul, did you do this? Paul tells us in Ephesians 2, because he says it was the cross of Jesus Christ that has dismantled the dividing wall of hostility. That phrase, dividing wall, is taking us now to temple imagery. You understand that the Jewish temple had four courts. The outermost court was the court of the Gentiles. It was the only court where Gentiles could worship. By the way, in Matthew 21, when Jesus comes in and cleanses the temple, he is, yes, reacting to the commercialization of the temple, where you had Jewish leaders selling their goods. But where were they selling their goods? In the court of the Gentiles, the only place where Gentiles could worship. I think Matthew 21, Jesus is also reacting to a subtle and insidious form of racism. These Jewish leaders were totally disregarding where the Gentiles could worship. And that's why Jesus quotes from Jeremiah that my house should be called a house of prayer, watch it, for all nations, for all people. So you had the court of the Gentiles. The next court, you had the court of women. Next court, you had the court of the Israelites. The next court, you had the court of the priests. And there was partitions dividing and separating the people from each court. Now, in the late 1800s, archaeologists actually found the partition that separated the court of the Gentiles from the other courts, and etched on it were words to the effect of, proceed no further upon fear of death. Paul says in Ephesians 2, the cross of Jesus Christ has dismantled the dividing wall of hostility. The imagery is poignant. Now people of different ethnicities can rush in together and worship God as one family. I don't know what it's like in your context, but in America, America gets an A+ for resurrecting what Christ has already demolished, which is the dividing wall of hostility. I think sadder than legislated segregation is voluntary segregation. We voluntarily avoid each other, don't do life with one another. I tell people here at our church, if people are still coming to church primarily out of relationships, then sanctuaries reflect dinner tables. In other words, if you want a diverse sanctuary, it begins with your dinner table. See, all of this is just living out the practical realities of the gospel. Well, what this now means is, it means that all of us must be intentional. All of us must be intentional. Just as Paul was intentional to go to the synagogue and to Mars Hill, the synagogue and to the Hall of Tyrannus, so you and I have to be intentional. Now, I'm guessing most of us on this call have heard of a guy named Dietrich Bonhoeffer. I mean, he wrote The Cost of Discipleship. There's a wonderful book called Bonhoeffer's Black Jesus. It's written by a brilliant scholar named Reggie Williams. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, when he was 21, he had a PhD and came over to the United States in the 1930s in Harlem, New York. And there in Harlem, New York, Dietrich Bonhoeffer joins a black church that's still around. It's called the Abyssinian Baptist Church. He joins a black church, sits under the leadership and teaching of his black pastor, teaches in the black Sunday school, befriends a guy named Albert, who introduces him to Negro spirituals, which Dietrich would take back with him to Germany. Albert takes him down to the Jim Crow South. Dietrich's mind is blown. Here's the point. Dietrich Bonhoeffer says, I do not go back to Germany and stand up for the oppressed unless I first experience the gospel to the oppressed. What I want you to understand, what shaped and formed Dietrich Bonhoeffer was cross-ethnic intentional relationships with people who were profoundly different. We need each other. And a part of the way that God disciples us, see, we here in the West, where I am, we are far too individualistic. See, I think this is what, and I'm going to butcher this word, so please forgive me. I think this is what Bishop Tutu was getting at in his book, No Future Without Forgiveness. He introduces me, he disciples me to this idea of Ubuntu, which is this idea of my humanity is inextricably tied to yours. We are missing that here in the West because discipleship is not just individual, it's communal. And a part of what shapes us profoundly is when we do life with people who are different, profoundly different than us. If you're married, you understand one of the greatest means of grace is that God gifted you with a person who's different than you and how that shaped you. So that should be as it relates to this new humanity and this new community. And so that's why when we get to 1 Corinthians 9, we see Paul's eclectic community. He says in 1 Corinthians 9, to the Jew, I became a Jew, which means he's got Jewish friends. But then he says to those outside the law, which are Gentiles, I became as one outside the law. Paul says, if you just follow my relationships, they are with different people who see it differently. Now, why, Paul, do you do this? He says, 1 Corinthians 9, I do it all for the sake of the gospel. I don't do it because of a political agenda. I don't do it because it's ideologically correct. I do it because the Jesus I serve died not just for one demographic, but he died for the world. And so to be a Jesus follower means I need to incarnate that. I need to flesh that out in very powerful and profound ways. So that's why last thing, 1 Corinthians 9 is powerful, because in 1 Corinthians 9, Paul says, he keeps saying, I have become. I have become. I have become. One scholar says this is the ability to get inside of another person's skin to feel what they feel. And so to do this, it's not just intentional, it's sacrificial. It means the laying down of personal preferences and cultural norms for the glory of God and the good of others. I have become. I have become. I have become. And so I'll share this last anecdote with you. You know, as God began to get a hold of my heart, in the spring of 2003, we decided to plant a church, and we dreamt of a church that would bring together the vertical and horizontal dimensions of the gospel. That we wanted that. And so we asked the Lord to send us to the most segregated city in the United States at the time, along black and white lines. At the time, it was Memphis, Tennessee. You all understand Memphis, Tennessee was a city in which Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. They have a city in honor to the founder of the KKK, a white domestic terrorist group. They have a park called Confederate Park. I think it's since been taken down because of the George Floyd protests. And God began to do a work. Well, our church grew, you know, from 26 people to several thousand, 65% white, 35% black. I was preaching one Sunday, and at the end of my sermon, an elderly black woman in her 80s, and I could tell she was a first-time visitor. I don't know how it is in South Africa, but in the South, in America, you can always tell first-time black visitors at multi-ethnic churches because we get dressed up. We wear the big hats and the dresses, you know, guys wear suits and ties. That's how we roll. And so she's dressed up. And I'm down front, and this 80-something-year-old woman squeezes my hand with all of her might, black woman, tears streaming down her face. She says, "Dear sir, I grew up in this city. I was here when they killed Dr. King. I served as a domestic, a maid in white homes. I was here during the curfews." She said to me, "I have been praying for decades for a church like this. You and this church are an answer to my prayers." I doubt if she heard much about the sermon that day. Her head was probably on a swivel as her mind is being blown at the demonstration of the gospel, drawing people from different ethnicities. That takes intentionality, it takes sacrifice, and yet it's worth it. Thank you.
Thank you, brother. Thank you so much for sharing the gospel and showing us how it relates to diversity as we've been speaking about it. Guys, if you have any questions for Brian, please do post them on the chat. I have some questions here for you, Brian. I think the first one, I think it's a bit of a typo, but I will paraphrase it. Is I think the question is, how do we combat with the gospel the conditioning we have every day that basically tells us that we should be separated rather than together. So the gospel teaches multi-ethnicity or multi-ethnic churches, yet our environment, the way we live in South Africa, so often the way we live is separated. When we go to work, depending on where you are in the ladder, you'll be interacting with a particular group of people compared to another group of people. Depending on where you take your children, that also might be very divided. So given this reality that bombards us daily, how do we effectively combat that with the gospel? Any tips or anything that is maybe useful in terms of that?
Yes, that's a very good question. Couple things here. One, in light of everything I just said, this will surprise you. I don't think every church should be multi-ethnic. I think every church should represent its community, right? So God burdens a pastor to reach a community. Now, the problem in America is the average community that a church sits in is 10 times more diverse than the church. And the average schools in the community that a church sits in is 20 times more diverse, right? So in America, the church is lagging behind the community and the schools. I don't know what it is in South Africa, but if I'm a church planter, typically what we begin with a church planter is, where has God burdened you to plant the church? And then that burden should be, I want to reach everybody in that place, right? And so I think place is really driving mission. And so you're going to have to be clear on that. The other thing too is just the reality. All of us are being discipled by the culture. And we're going to have to learn the things that are not healthy and resist those actively. And there's multiple ways to do that. And all these things have to be working together. We've got to be people of the scriptures, profoundly dedicated to the truth of God's word. But we've also got to be people who are profoundly communal. What has been one of the most redemptive things in my life is relationships, friendships that I've had with different ethnicities, especially my white brothers and sisters. Paul models this. Leadership 101 says, I cannot take people to a place authentically that I am not personally traveling to myself. I've got to model that. So that's why 1 Corinthians 9 is so beautiful, because Paul is saying, I'm not just planting multi-ethnic churches. I have a multi-ethnic life. I have a multi-ethnic dinner table, right? And so the onus is on us as leaders. Who are you doing relationships with? Listen, when the George Floyd thing happened, my son, who's now 20, he was, like all of us, angry, but his was more of an unrighteous anger. And he is beside himself. We're sitting on the sofa there. And he is saying all white people this, all white people that, and how bad white people are. And I said, I got to stop you. And I start calling out Uncle Adam and Aunt Nikki, this white Swedish couple that we vacation with every year, who's always at our house. Uncle Bobby, Aunt Heather, another white couple, always at our house. So what I'm trying to say is, we hurt in isolation, but we heal in community. And proximity breeds empathy. Distance breeds suspicion. When I'm walking with people and I'm going shoulder to shoulder, America's so politically divided right now. So when I have Democratic friends and when I have Republican friends, that works on my empathy muscles. And so for the good of our own souls, as well as our leadership, we have to be intentional about forming relationships with the ethnically other. And that's going to be a sacrifice.
Thank you, brother. There's a question here, I think you've already touched on it, that talks about if you have a church in an area that's rather homogeneous, and then an area that is changing around it, should that church basically aim for change? And what I heard you basically saying is that the pastor's mission or the church's mission should always be seeking to reach out to the community that is around it, whatever the makeup of the community is. Another question here is on the topic of gospel and race. I think, who is the most fruitful white person you know currently contributing and taking part in this conversation, and why? So I guess it's looking for somebody, I guess, from a white perspective that will help to speak into this. I don't know if from your reading or people you interact with, some helpful people to be listening to.
So on the academic side, Dr. Michael Emerson is a Jesus-loving white sociologist who has gifted us with wonderful research and books to help us here. So you should read his book if you haven't already, Divided by Faith. He's just got several out there. So I would look up Michael Emerson on the internet, Amazon, whatever it may be, and you can look for his things. So that's from the academic side. As far as actual practitioners go, there are people like Dr. Larry Lloyd, Lloyd. He has started several ministries, this dear Jesus loving white man, in urban communities, but he's placed a premium on raising up indigenous leaders and then giving the ministry away to them, and then moving on to somewhere else and setting up other ministries. Matt Chandler, a pastor in Dallas, Texas, is doing a great job at this as well. He's been a strong voice, which has been really helpful in this regard. Those are just a few that I would say, as far as our white brothers who've done a wonderful job in this area.
And then I think final question before we move on, we may double back to you at the end. But one of the questions that is being asked is that often the perception, or at least the experience of some of the Black brothers, is that when it comes to the issue of multi-ethnicity or trying to move together, it often seems as if it's black people who are moving towards white people, and they are the ones who are often compromising the most. They are spending the time doing all the fighting racial issues, and such that they have no energy left for discipleship. So how do we all get burned out and become disillusioned actually with the church? So how do we balance being intentional about being multi-ethnic with our brothers, but at the same time not exhausting our energy of discipleship and work and working with people? I think is the heart of the question.
Yeah, that's a great question. The answer is multifaceted. One, I would affirm. In fact, I'm finishing up my dissertation on this right now. I have a few more pages left, and just this morning, I was writing some based on some research that I did. The latest trends in the United States affirm really what you're saying, and that is when we talk about churches transitioning into being multi-ethnic, it's a one-way street. It's Blacks leaving the Black church, joining white churches, and helping them to become multi-ethnic. There's really no such thing as a existing Black church of any significant size where whites are leaving their churches to join in on the Black church. I will say it from an American perspective, it's a power dynamic. In America, our white brothers and sisters, by and large, have expressed a historical discomfort by their actions when it comes to submitting to leadership that is minority, and themselves being a minority. That is still an issue for us in America. And it drives me crazy. As it relates to, I think the second part of your question is, now we're getting to issues of emotional health. So you do understand Moses was barred from the promised land because he didn't take care of his emotional health. After years and years of grumbling and complaining, he struck the rock when God told him to speak to the rock. Pastoring is tough. Christian leadership is tough. You're dealing with a lot of grumbling. Now you take that up by 1,000% when I'm trying to lead against one of the primary weapons Satan has used historically to divide us, which is race. And so you're going to take a lot of hits, and you're going to have to fight for your emotional health. And what that looks like is you're going to have to be fiercely devoted to taking a Sabbath. I'm trying to figure out when in world history we put an asterisk next to the command, one of 10 commands, to take a Sabbath. But you're going to have to say to yourself, once a week, I'm just unplugging and I'm getting away from it all. I've done Sabbaths where I said, you know what, I've been reading too much about race. And I'm going to stop reading about this because now my mind is just wired. Everything is about race. And so I've got to take a break from that. You need to vacation. Well, use all your vacation every year. I hear pastors say all the time, oh man, I haven't had a vacation in such a long time, in a year or two, whatever it may be, as if that's a badge of honor. That's not. You've got to guard your heart, for from it flow the springs of life. So take care of yourself emotionally. Play well, hobby well, enjoy great friendships, great food, great drink. Take care of yourself. This is hard work. If Jesus constantly withdrew and got away, as the gospel writers present him, how much more do we? And then lastly, I'll say this. Every pastor needs to have these words from John the Baptist framed somewhere in their house. They asked John the Baptist, are you the one we've been looking for? Meaning, are you the Messiah? And his response is what every pastor needs to be able to say. He says, I am not the Christ. Every pastor needs to be able to say that. I am not the Christ. I can't fix your marriage. I haven't been called to solve, decades and centuries of racism. I don't have a magic answer for that. I'm going to do my best, empowered by the Spirit of God, but I am not the Christ. In fact, can we all just say that together? Can we just say that together? 1, 2, 3. I am not the Christ.
Thank you, brother. Thank you, Brian. I think let's move on for the sake of time to our brother Doug. Doug, are you with us?
How's that?
Hi, Doug. Could you basically share with us, because you've been in South Africa for over 31 years. You've been in Gauteng, and one of the things I hear that is quite encouraging about your ministry has been your ability to work and collaborate with quite widely with people from different corners of life. And perhaps maybe share some of your experience of how that has happened and why that has been such a burden, and how is it that you've been able to do that for all these years?
Yeah, thanks, Musa, and thanks for letting me be a part of this. And I really appreciated, Brian, your exhortation, your exposition of Ephesians 2. And I think that's exactly what has driven us as a church. And I think our involvement with other cultures as a church has really been a result of being driven by this gospel and the Great Commission. I mean, the Great Commission, which most of us can quote from Matthew 28, is that we're to make disciples of all the nations. And that doesn't simply mean sending missionaries from your church, across an ocean, across borders somewhere else. It begins where we're at. And so as we're making disciples within our own communities and within the nation, then we're going to be dealing with people of other ethnicities. And the gospel really is what overcomes those barriers. So as a church, as we've just been committed to making disciples and being involved in church planting, then we have a desire to partner with those that share our conviction about the gospel and the local church and the Great Commission. And so I think over the years, this is just it's been a journey, and it's been rather organic. So I've been at Brackenhurst, this is my 28th year as the pastor. When I first came to this church, it was 99% white. We're probably now about 70% white, and that reflects our community. So when I moved here in 1993 to this church, though the laws were off the books, there was still within our country this segregation of where people were allowed to live. And my community was completely white, but that's changed over the years. And so our church has been just reflecting the community changes over the years. But I think also just relationships that we've developed with other brothers and sisters from other cultures and other pastors. And so I have many pastor friends who are not white like me. And through those relationships, we've been able to learn from one another and to really develop a great love for churches, and particularly in the townships. So this is developed, again, not something that we really planned, but just an organic growth out of our commitment to the gospel and the Great Commission. So we've been involved over the years in helping some pastors who are in the townships, the poorer areas, helping them financially, supporting the pastors, because we realize that in many cases, their churches are not in a position to be able to do that. But it hasn't just been a matter of throwing money outside of our community. It really has come about by relationships. So we've had pastors of other ethnicities come to our church and to preach at our church. We have an indaba that we have once a year around our missions conference. And one of the things that we do there is really discussing with pastors who will come, how can we practically, we understand the principle, they're supposed to work with one another, but we talk about how can we practically encourage one another, partner with one another, and help one another. And there's many avenues in that, and one of those is financial. So one of my dear friends pastors a church in the township, and I went to his church one day, and I realized all that we have as a church and all that this brother's church doesn't have. And they were renting a place. They want to have their own building. And just through a contact that I have, actually a family member of mine in the States, he took $50,000 out of his retirement and said, please give it to this church so they can buy a piece of ground. And our church here, we were going to give 100,000 Rand to help them to start the building. And the congregation said, that's not enough. Let's give them 200,000 Rand. And it was wonderful to see that from the congregation, just coming alongside and loving this brother, loving this church, and wanting to help them. I've been involved in some seminars where we're helping pastors who really haven't had the advantage of some good theological training, and hosting them at our church, and teaching principles of ministry, of pastoring, expository preaching. And again, it's nothing that we really orchestrated, but a lot of this just came out of relationships. And some brothers that I did just had a great fondness for, and just sought to have a relationship with them and to spend time with them, having meals with them, and listening to them. I did a series on racism some years ago from Acts chapter 6, where you have the Jewish church electing 7 Greek-speaking, if not 7 Gentiles, to be their deacons. And one of the things that we learned as a church through that series was the need to really hear one another, to listen to one another. And I think that's helped us as a congregation as we're listening and hearing the needs of others, and moving beyond our comfort zones. That's helped us in building relationships with others. You asked in the email, why we see this as something important. We see it as important because our brothers and sisters matter, regardless of whether we all look the same. And the Great Commission cuts through all of that because of the gospel. So I think all of that has really helped us. There's also another principle that's quite clear. I mean, you look at the Lord's call of Abraham in Genesis 12, that Abraham was blessed to be a blessing. And I just preached on this last weekend when I was in the church in the States, that we're called to to share the blessings that God has given to us. Our congregation is financially fairly well off. We want to share those blessings. There's many blessings we've had as a church that we're not supposed to just hoard, but we're to share those with others. So I think a lot of that is what's driving, because the gospel is driving us this way, to us being able to partner, to collaborate, to use your word, with others. The question arises sometimes is there a hesitancy of suburban churches to work with churches in townships? And that may be true, but maybe it's not so much a hesitancy as it is just a neglect. And a lot of that neglect, if you want to use the word hesitancy, really I think is fueled by, in our churches, regardless of where our churches are, we can be so focused just on our own church. Now, I'm passionate about the local church. I think the local church is the hope of the world as we take seriously the Great Commission. But there's a danger of being so focused on our own church that we become blind to the needs of other local churches around us. And so I think that as we as a congregation pay close attention to our own congregation and seeking to make disciples where we're at and strengthening the base of our church, there should be a natural overflow there to minister to brothers and sisters in other churches, particularly those that have been historically disadvantaged. And so again, flowing from the gospel, flowing from the Great Commission, we learn to look beyond ourselves to the needs of others. I think sometimes suburban churches are hesitant to work with churches in townships because of fear. Because whenever you partner, whenever you collaborate, it's always risky. And so churches, though we should share and all share in the same gospel, or should be, we have our own culture in our churches, and we need to learn to not make everybody cross their T's and dot their I's like we do. And when we're talking about the fundamentals of the faith, we want everybody crossing the T's and dotting the I's in the same way. But there are cultural differences between Brackenhurst Baptist Church and perhaps Grace Baptist Church in Davidson. And that shouldn't be a big deal because cultures are different. And as an American, or raised as an American, living here the last 31 years, I've had to learn that the culture I come from is not the standard. And I think as we're willing to be uncomfortable and move out of our own cultural comforts, then some of those hesitancies can fall away. So I think that if there are hesitancies, we need to work at overcoming those. I think that one thing that really helps us, and I alluded to this earlier, again, is a willingness to listen to one another, to hear where our brothers and sisters are coming from and how they view. I've had lots of conversations with friends. How do they view so-called white suburban churches? And I want to hear that. I want to learn from that, because I want to be careful that I'm not ministering and leading a church with blinders on. We need to hear from one another. And I think one thing that's helped me is actually visiting other churches. It's great to go to a church that's in a different part of town, a church that looks different than my church, and to go there not as a teacher, but to go there as a student and to listen. I think of Jeremiah in Lamentations when he said that my eye has affected my heart. And Jesus, when he saw the multitudes, when he saw that they were harassed, he had compassion on them. And so I think moving out of our comfort zones and looking and listening and trying to understand where people are coming from a different ethnicity really helps us to love them well. It helps us to serve them well. And again, it just kind of forces us to move beyond those comfort zones and to build healthy relationships with others. I think some helpful ways, you asked me to touch on this, to work with others, is I think, again, being intentional to gather with pastors of different cultures, different ethnicities, whether that's a fraternal, whether it's a Gauteng alliance, whatever the fraternal looks like. It's going to be helpful to get together, to build relationships, and to listen to one another. Again, I think visiting other churches and encouraging, as pastors, our church members that go visit the church in Hillbrow. We've had a relationship with the church in Hillbrow for 25 years, if not more. And some of our people have gone to Hillbrow on a Sunday service, and they've been in a church very different than ours. And it's been really helpful for them. So I think practically helping people to move beyond where we're comfortable, to visit other places is great. I think, again, and I touched on this earlier, sharing financially. When this pandemic hit, and as we're well aware in South Africa, it hit us hard as a nation. I mean, we already have an unemployment rate near 50%. And a lot of our churches, and particularly churches in the township as well as suburbs, have suffered. And it's been great to see people in our church want to help. And not just our church, but I hear testimonies of a lot of churches that are saying, how can we help our brothers and sisters who are particularly in need right now? So sharing our finances. And, in Paul, this multi-ethnic missionary, what is he? A lot of the New Testament addresses him actually going around collecting offerings to meet the needs of others. In Acts chapter 11, that beautiful story of the church at Antioch, when they heard about those in Jerusalem that were suffering because of this famine upon the whole world. It's interesting that famine upon the whole world included Antioch, but they didn't storehouse for themselves. They said, let's help our brothers. And they sacrificially gave, even in the time of their own need, to help others. I think those kind of practical ways can help us to build relationships and to encourage one another. And just lastly, Musa, you'd asked me to mention some perhaps unhelpful ways to work with others. I'm not sure quite how to articulate this, but I think there's always a danger when we're partnering with others, is sometimes partnering with strings attached. And again, I don't mean by that compromising on any of the fundamentals of the faith. But if we require sameness of those we work with, I don't think that's helpful. You have to allow a church to develop its own personality within its culture. And that means that some of the worship practices or the expressions of worship, I should put it that way, might be different. So be it. Cultures are different. I go to India every year and to churches of like faith, but they look very different. And their expression of worship is very different than our church. And again, I think assuming that what works in one context is going to work in all contexts, that can be a problem. And maybe finally, I can just say this, that I think we have to really be careful, regardless of what color we are, of a know-it-all attitude. We need to humble ourselves. Be careful how I say this, but I do think that sometimes when we partner, we want to partner with the upper hand and assume that we have all the answers. And I've been at it for a long time, and I can assure you, the longer at it, it seems like the more questions I have. I think we need to have a spirit of teachability and learning from our brothers and sisters. I have learned so much about ministry by partnering with brothers who are pastoring in the township. In fact, in many ways, they're my heroes. The way they persevere and their wisdom in difficult situations. So, yeah, I would just encourage us really to have the mindset of the Apostle Paul. And I love these words in Romans 1, where Paul writes to the Romans, and he says, "For I long to see you, that I may impart to you some spiritual gift to strengthen you. That is, that we may be mutually encouraged by each other's faith, both yours and mine." So here's the Apostle Paul saying, I want to come to Rome, and yeah, I have some things I can teach you. I have some things I can encourage you with, but I'm coming there for you to encourage me and to teach me as well. And I think if we had more of that spirit in our churches, we would see a lot more healthy biblical collaborating taking place. So I hope that's helpful in some way.
Thank you, Doug. It's very helpful. And thank you for that spirit. I think it's worth saying what AJ has said there. He says, what I hear you say is listening is equal to learning. It's such a simple concept, but man, do we struggle with that. Brothers and sisters, please feel free to write any questions that you may have for both Doug and Brian. We're going to do another Q&A just to ask them a few questions on this very important issue. So while people are coming up with questions, maybe I'll go back to you, Brian, with some questions, and perhaps even to you, Doug. So one of the questions that was asked in terms of the issue of working with people who are different is, how do we practice forgiveness as we address injustice? Does forgiveness mean forgetting? Brian, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. You know, I think if you've been, especially in this space, if you've been a human as a follower of Jesus Christ, you've had to deal with that, right? And a lot of times for me, you know, C.S. Lewis talks about that line in the Lord's Prayer, you know, forgive me of my debts as I also forgive my debtors. Oftentimes, that's not just a one and done prayer. Most times, that's a constant prayer that we're having to bring the same individual and the same offense over and over and over to God. So, you know, I've had to do that. I've felt betrayal in my life, you know, from my white brothers and sisters, and I've felt deeply harmed. And I've got to constantly forgive. A lot of time, what's helped me is to not just ask God for the grace to forgive, but at the same time praying prayers of blessing over them. I remember this one brother, I constantly prayed Numbers 6:24-26 over him. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. You know, you start praying prayers of blessings over people who have wounded you. That's huge. And then living out Matthew 18. You know, I think there's the me and God, we're going to work this out. But often what helps to speed that up is not storing up offenses, but sitting down across the table from one another. And to have the humility to say, hey, when you said this, this is how I heard it. When you did this, this is how I perceived it. And let's talk it out. You know, we've got to be careful when Paul says, speak the truth in love. Oftentimes in these matters, we don't have truth right away. What we have is perception. And so being able to come in humility and say, this is how I perceived it. And then as men, this is especially tough for us to talk on a level 4 kind of communication, which is emotive, to say, when you said this, this is how I felt. When you did this, this is how I felt. This is how that made me feel. That's a foreign language to men in general. But if you do those things, I think it'll speed it up. And then the last thing I'll say is forgiveness and justice can work hand in hand. God is both a forgiving God and a just God. The Bible only tells us to not seek vengeance. You know, vengeance is a personal thing. But you can forgive someone. You know, if there was someone who abused you know, a family member of yours, which, listen, I had to deal with this in a very public fashion. I had a brother-in-law who worked for me who abused one of my sisters that he wasn't married to. I forgave him and I fired him. Those two things can go hand in hand. And so we've got to be able to walk those tensions out.
Thank you, Brian. Doug, for you, do you have a story you can tell us about where you saw reconciliation gaining traction in your church, specifically in the partnerships you have, perhaps with people who are from the townships or in a different cultural environment?
Yeah, I think all this is related. I remember many, many years ago, visiting with a man in our church, an old Afrikaans man, and he just broke down in tears when he talked about growing up in the apartheid system, and just horrified as he realized some of his attitudes and actions. And he said, you know, that's the way I was raised, and this is the way I was taught. And he said, I can see now, because of the gospel, just how wicked that was. And he just began to expand his relationships with those who were different from him from that point on. And that was a real blessing. We had a black man that came to faith in Christ, and we baptized him many years ago when the church was very, very white. And he had been a part of the Communist Party, and had a real almost aggression towards white people. And he stood in the baptismal waters and gave his testimony and said, if you would have told me years ago that I would be baptized and loving white people, he said, I would have thought you were crazy. But the gospel had just changed his heart, and he's been a member of the church for many years, and loves his brothers and sisters regardless of their color. And I think that just over the years, with the preaching of the word and attitudes changing, that has made it far easier for us as a church to expand our relationships and to partner with others. And people are looking at people who are different than them as simply brothers and sisters in Christ that we can work with. So I think it's been almost a slow process that's happened through the ministry of the gospel.
Thanks, Doug. A question for you, Brian. What are some of the mistakes you have seen in churches or church planters as they pursue to see healthy multi-ethnic communities of faith? Mistakes that have been done by white leaders or planters, and mistakes that have been done by Black church leaders and planters.
Yeah, you know, on the Black church leader side, you know, a lot of times our passion is birthed out of our pain. But it's a dangerous thing to minister out of a sense of unresolved pain. The book of Jonah, really, it's profound, and I don't think it gets talked enough about, but Jonah is really helpful for me as a minority ministering cross-ethnically, because that's Jonah, right? Here he is, a minority. He's an ethnic Jew, commanded to carry the gospel, not just to a different group of people, but a group of people who are oppressing the Jews. And the strong racial, ethnic undertones there is huge. And Jonah gets mad, and the book of Jonah ends like a bad reality show. Jonah gets really mad because God shows kindness to his oppressors. And the pulpit is not the place to work out your anger issues. And I know a lot of Black leaders who are trying to minister cross-ethnically, but have not dealt with their pain. They're wounded, they're not broken. And those are two very different things. And so you've got to deal with your pain. On the other side of the street with our white leaders, oftentimes they can come across as very messianic and patriarchal. I tell my white brothers and sisters all the time, if your only relationships with people of color are from a helping posture, you are going to entrench the very thing that needs to be dismantled. What our white brothers and sisters need is they need to nuance their relationships, and they need peer relationships with Black people who don't need them. I don't need white people. I own my own home. I make a decent living. I can take a white family out to dinner and pay for it. I don't need them. The power dynamic there is equal. So I think what's good for your soul, my white brothers, is you need peer relationships with people. And let me explain what that means. You don't have a peer relationship with a Black person in your church who works for you. It's not a peer relationship. You need a peer relationship, white lead pastor, with a Black lead pastor of another church. They don't need you. They're not dependent on you for a paycheck. That's what you need for the good of your own soul.
Amen to that, brother. A question for you, Doug. How do you encourage people within your own network who are not convinced that it is the church's job to reach widely? How serious or concerned would you see the lack of interest in other brothers in reaching out more widely and having leadership that reflects community? So I guess speaking specifically in your circle, so people who are not convinced that it's worth doing what you're doing, working with multi-ethnic, reaching out, how do you help to convince those brothers?
Yeah, I think that's a gospel issue. I don't see how anybody couldn't be convinced, though we know there are, but it doesn't make any sense when you understand the gospel. So then when you're looking at Ephesians chapter 2, that clearly leads us into crossing our own cultural ethnocentricity. Again, Acts chapter 6 for our church has been such a help. When you see a church that, that actually in that situation, it was a majority who was sensitive to a minority, and they obviously listened to the complaints. They listened to the concerns of these Greek-speaking segment of the church, and they responded by not selecting 7 Jewish deacons or men, but 7 probably Gentiles, at least Greek-speaking, Hellenized Jewish people. And I think that's very, very significant. In our culture here, I mean, the whites were a huge minority, but there's this power issue, I suppose, because of the financial dynamic and the political dynamic and a lot of dynamics I don't quite understand. But particularly white pastors need to go back and actually look at the book of Acts and see that this issue of facing this divide and working towards unity is all through the book of Acts. Whether it's Cornelius, whether it's the church at Antioch, you just see it over and over again. So I would say to my brothers, you need to look at what the scriptures are teaching here, and it's clear we have a responsibility. And again, I would run to Matthew 28, those last 2 verses, where the Great Commission is about discipling the nations. So how can we take seriously the Great Commission and be so concerned about those in other nations, but not those within our own nation and all the people groups in our own nation? It it's just, it's a contradiction of what we profess to believe. So I'd want to have some serious conversations of how do you see the gospel? How do you see this being fleshed out? And how do you view the Great Commission? That would be a starting point.
Thank you, brothers. I think we probably end it there. I can see there are a few more questions, but I think for the sake of time, perhaps let's pause there. I just want to say thank you, brothers, so much. Thank you, O'Brien, for your time. Thank you, Doug, for your time at this moment. It's really been very insightful, very challenging at times, some of the things that have been shared, but I think it speaks to the heart of what we are looking to do as the Gauteng Alliance. We really believe that we should be working across, especially with the poor. And so we are seeking to see how that can happen in different ways and in different shapes. So thank you for speaking into that.
One more thing.
Yes,
I would gladly love to come to South Africa, and all you would have to pay me is Nando's chicken. That's all.
Deal. We can organize some Nando's for you, brother. Some of that Portuguese spice. Before we leave, maybe just some next steps in terms of some of other things that we would love you guys to be a part of in terms of the Gauteng Alliance. So please write it in your diaries. The 19th, or save in your diaries, the 19th of May. We're going to be looking at the last talk in our series of the DNA series, and we're going to be looking at gospel generosity in collaboration. We're going to have a webinar on the 19th of May at 7 p.m. Please diarize it, and closer to the time, we will share more information. But also on the 24th of April at 10 a.m., we're going to have our township in Daba, where we're going to be looking at township engagement. How do we communicate and embody the gospel in a township context? As people come in that context, how do we engage with people? In effect, we are talking about contextualization. So please diarize that date. We'll share the venue for that event closer to the time, but the 19th of May will be a webinar. Thank you guys so much for your time and being a part of this meeting. God bless you, and we hope to see you next time. Thank you, brothers and sisters.
Thanks, Musa.
Cheers.
Bye, gents.